This episode is all about nurturing and developing your tax staff, including key areas where tax professionals usually need help and how to help them. We're joined by Pete Miller, a well-known name in the profession, and for good reason. You're listening to episode 84 of the Tax Professionals podcast, the podcast that helps tax professionals to progress, develop and improve their careers.
Welcome to the Tax Professionals podcast, the podcast dedicated to helping you improve your tax career. Here's your host, Jack Bonehill.
Hi everyone and welcome to this episode. This episode is on a topic that, as you will know if you've been a long time listener of the podcast, that I am, dare I say, passionate about. I'm not a fan of using the word passionate when it comes to anything work related, but can't think of a better word to describe it, so apologies everyone, but I am passionate about helping people in my team and the wider profession to improve and develop. Pete Miller, this episode's guest, is someone I've wanted on the podcast for some time. I've known of Pete for a long time, long before I started the podcast. He's won awards, has done tax writing, tax lecturing, and many other great things for the tax profession. You only need to take a quick look at his LinkedIn profile to get a feel for this. Pete ran his own business for 11 years or so, joining forces with Jerams to form Jerams Miller Specialist Tax in April 2022. He didn't work with a team of other tax professionals for the 11 years he ran his own business, the Miller Partnership, but interestingly, nurturing and developing staff is part of his remit. Now he's part of Jerams Miller Specialist Tax. Since he'd not done developing and nurturing for such a long time, I was keen to know how he'd been getting on, what he's observed, and how he's been helping his new team. I was interested in getting his perspective and what action he is taking to help his staff. And as I expected, he was full of great advice and tips, which you'll hear all of in this episode. You'll hear a bit about Pete's career and what's led him to this point. You'll hear about his current remit in nurturing tax staff and where he's focusing his efforts, methods that he's using to train his tax staff, and a brief discussion around whether it's possible for a member of staff to become a lost cause despite you trying to help them. Rough timings for each section of this episode can be found within the details section within the episode within your podcast player of choice, or by heading on over to the show notes for this episode at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP84. That link is the only link you need to remember for this episode, as all other links and information mentioned throughout this episode are included in the show notes. So again, the link is thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP84. One of the things that's most difficult about nurturing staff is finding the time to do it. And I know this from my own experience, as I can get so busy doing the day job. And that's where courses can play a part to help. This is one of the many reasons I have created my 2 masterclasses for tax professionals, and I'll continue to make more. The masterclasses are there partly to help take off the pressure from managers in relation to training by giving their staff a strong foundation to build upon and accelerate the development of a vital skill to working in tax. Currently, I have the Tax Research Masterclass, which is broadly there to teach people how to find the answer to any tax question, use tax legislation and HMRC guidance, and the Tax Advice Masterclass to teach people how to provide top quality tax advice. Details for both of these masterclasses can be found at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/masterclasses, including a 1-page business case if you would like your employer to pay. If, like me, you're interested in knowing what you're worth in terms of salary, then get in touch with James from the Tax Recruitment Company to benchmark what you're currently on. From his interaction with many different businesses and tax professionals, he has current knowledge of salary rates based on experience and specialism. Speaking with James would help you to negotiate a pay rise or determine it's time to find a new role. Contact details for James can be found in the show notes for this episode at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP84, or you can book a chat with him by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/salary chat. So get in touch with James to benchmark your salary or to discuss potentially available roles, particularly if you work in corporation tax, as he's currently recruiting for many roles in this area. Without further ado, let's get to the episode. Could you tell us a little bit about you, your tax career, and what's led you to this point?
Yes. Okay. So my tax career. Well, somebody once pointed out that career is a verb as well as a noun. And in my case, I think my career was both, in the sense that nothing was planned. And I seemed to end up in quite a nice place almost by accident. But where it started from a tax perspective is 35 years ago this April, when I joined the Inland Revenue in their sort of graduate intake scheme. I wasn't a new graduate, but they had a particular scheme for graduates, and they were particularly targeting the teaching professions and sciences, and saying to people, come and join us and train up as an inspector. So instead of having to join as a clerical officer and get promoted, you basically went straight in at inspector level. So I worked with the Inland Revenue for 10 years, had a thoroughly good time, and we moaned a lot about the inefficiencies of the organisation, but thank heavens we didn't know what it would become after the merger with Customs and Excise, because there are people I know, and I guess to some extent I'm one of them, who are almost ashamed to admit to any association, even in the past, with the organisation that it currently is, if organisation is the word to use. But I, like a lot of people, left the Inland Revenue. To be fair, as I say, I did 10 years there and had a range of jobs, which was amazing. I joined Big Four firms and spent 11 years with KPMG and Ernst & Young. And again, learned a huge amount, worked for some great people, discovered also some of the limitations of large professional organizations, and then worked for a while with a small firm in Leicester called Powery Appleby, where I became a partner. There were sort of three partners and a retired partner, as it were, and about 15 staff. And then when they got taken over by a slightly larger firm, I went out on my own for 11 years and ran something that some of you might remember called the Miller Partnership. And really, since I left the revenue, I have specialised in M&A transactions, corporate transactions of all types, management buyouts, demergers, straightforward purchases and sales. And obviously, once I was working in the shall we say, the more owner-managed end of the market, I was working a lot with the individuals as well, whose personal wealth we were looking at. So I obviously did a lot of work on things like the income tax and capital gains tax side of buying and selling companies. So transactions in securities, entrepreneurs relief, business asset disposal relief, as it now is, and a lot of stuff like that.
Yeah.
So I guess that's where I am now. About a year and a half ago, slightly less than that, but I'd been approached. I've been working with this firm, Jerams, for a very long time as one of their advisors, their external consultants. And when I reached a certain age, and I'll let you work out which age that is, they made me an offer, which was, instead of having to sort of run my business down, close the doors to new business, finish what I'm doing, etc., when I finally decide to retire, they said, well, why don't you join forces with us? We'll mix you up with our corporate tax team, and you can train the next generation of tax advisors, at least within the Jerams organization.
Yeah. Because before Jerams Miller, I very much saw you as like an OMB person. I don't know if that's a fair way to...
Yeah, I mean, I'd become that. So the reason I ended up being recruited to do sort of M&A transactions with Big Four firms was because my last job in the Inland Revenue was a head office role, which was actually called Technical Division Company Distributions, which doesn't immediately sound like it lends itself to an M&A training, but what I actually did a lot of was the demerger clearances for exempt distribution demergers, because as the name suggests, this is a form of demerger using a distribution in specie of assets of a company or group, for which you can get clearance that the transaction is exempt from income tax on distributions at shareholder level, which was pretty important. And in fact, in those days, it was also quite important that the company didn't have a huge hit to something called advanced corporation tax, which the older members of the audience might have heard of. But that actually was a doorway, if you like, into M&A transactions, because we worked closely with the people who gave capital gains tax clearances and transactions in securities clearances. And nowadays, of course, they're all in one place. But at that time, the individual parts of the Inland Revenue that had operational responsibility for the relevant legislation also dealt with the clearances relevant to their legislation.
Interesting. I didn't know that. It's not, you haven't just done your normal tax job in a way, because you've done a lot of like things with different bodies and organizations and stuff as well. Like, how have you like found the time to do all that? Because you seem to have done so many. When I look at your LinkedIn profile, it's like 30 things listed under experience. Like,
yes.
how?
Yes, that is an interesting one, isn't it? I suppose, it started off with people sort of asking if I'd join this, that, or the other committee, and me being quite flattered that somebody would ask me. And then you discover that some of these jobs really are quite hard work, but not often. So, for example, being on a CIOT technical committee, apart from committing, for want of a better word, to try to be at most of the meetings, which is nowadays much easier because they're often online, the amount of work you do in between the meetings is very often nothing, or relatively low. One or two committees, occasionally you might get involved in a particular project, and then for a little while you have to do some extracurricular work. But the other thing I think is that as I grew older in the profession, and I guess particularly after I joined the CIOT in particular, because I didn't join until 2009, I think, because I didn't need to. I was an inland revenue tax inspector and then working for big four firms. So why did I need to be a member of the institute? But they kind of invited me to join. And that's the point when you realize that there's a lot of people out there who might benefit in some way, usually indirectly, from some of the stuff I've done, from some of my experience. I hesitate to use the word wisdom, because most people would hesitate to use the word wisdom when it comes to me. But I've been there, done that, eaten a lot of pies, big firms, small firms, so large corporate, OMB, inland revenue, private sector. Pretty much the only thing I haven't done is to work in a tax role in industry. And the CIOT wasn't asking me because they wanted to sort of pat me on the head and say, you're a terribly nice chap. They're actually asking me because they felt I had something to offer. And then you realize that there's a lot of people and organizations throughout my tax career that had one way or another helped me. And it was perhaps incumbent upon me to try and pay it forward a little bit. Yes, there's a lot of work involved sometimes. And sometimes it's just there's a lot of meetings involved and I have to work late to make up the time.
Yeah, which happens at times. But so it sounds like that anyway, you were doing it almost like to give back. Because I always wonder when people get involved in a lot of these things outside of the day job, whether it's like, say, to get a better profile, to maybe win more work, do all those type of things. I mean, was there a bit of an element of that as well?
I think in terms of things like CIOT and ICAW technical committees, no. I think it's probably fair to say that some of the other things I've taken on, maybe there was a feeling that having my name in that place might look good. So being on the editorial board of Simon's Taxes, for example, for a time I was I've forgotten what the word is now, but there was some kind of editor or whatever of Tolly Guidance in its early days. I wrote a lot of the early material. I no longer have that role, but that again was something I thought, well, that's a good role to have, because if people see when they look at the material that I'd written it, they might come to me and ask for advice on it. So some of the stuff, yes, there was a marketing angle as well. But the interesting thing you point out is that I have some general knowledge, certainly, of what I call sort of business tax. So, while most of what I do is about corporate transactions, because I had a very broad training, like most people, and because for parts of my career I have had to do the more general work as well, it's meant that I do have, in some areas, the broader perspective that allows me to give a different kind of return than just passing on my very deep but very narrow technical knowledge. One of the things I discovered, though, and I think, for example, having been an examiner at various times for both CIOT and the ATT, is that people assume, because of who I am, that I am a very good generalist. And I found some of those roles, and I mentioned the examiner roles in particular, very frustrating, because actually doing questions, setting and marking questions for the examination system, you do have to be something of a generalist, much more of a generalist than I am, because you need to set exam questions that are fair and broad, because at this point that people are taking the exams, they've only got broad and generally not deep knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So at times the generalist bit has been, I think, overblown by people who think just because I'm expert in one area, I must basically know everything about everything.
Makes sense. Yeah, I suppose with the exams, you've always got to do questions that are relevant as well to like the world as it is today. Because if you set a bunch of completely theoretical questions, they're not going to be really any help for those people doing those exams in the real world, right? And if you weren't experiencing that must have made it even more difficult, even outside of the technical side of it, just thinking, does this actually happen anymore? Or is this the type of questions that come through as an advisor now?
I think that's right. And when you are writing questions and you have a specific set of expertises, it's very difficult to take your mindset into, but let's write a question that isn't specifically about a demerger or a management buyout or due diligence on a company that you're buying. Let's put in something about, I don't know, leasing assets, because we haven't covered that in the exam system recently, or something like that. And then you think, well, that's great, but I don't know anything about leasing assets and the tax behind leasing assets. I've got to go learn it. And in a way, similar with, there's certain editorial roles I have. I've mentioned Simon's taxes, but at least that's generally quite specific. You're in charge of this bit.
Yeah.
With one or two other things that I at one point, I was one of two authors of Bloomsbury Professionals Corporation Tax Annual. And while we were talking about the stuff I know about, I was happy to update it and enjoyed updating it. And then you'd get something that said, right, here's a whole load of new stuff on the loan relationships rules that needs updating. And then I go, oh, but I don't know those rules. I don't know those rules enough to know what the updating actually means, that kind of thing. And that's where perhaps people have overestimated my general knowledge.
Yeah. I suppose it must have forced you, though, to learn those things and to keep up to date doing those roles anyway.
To the extent possible, yes. I think actually, I mean, the situation I had in mind was the very major rewrite of the loan relationship rules. And I actually took the view that I was not competent to write a book a chapter to the standard that the Bloomsbury Professional Tax Annuals required on that subject. Updating when you know that somebody's changed a time limit from 3 years to 5 years, or when there are similarly minor changes, which it's fairly obvious what has changed within the legislation. And there's usually a note somewhere that explains why that change was made, which is relatively easy, even if you don't know the subject very well. But when it's a wholesale change to an entire regime that you're not familiar with, I think that's when you have to say, I'm sorry, this isn't really I could learn it and write something about it that might make sense, but these books are written by people, or meant to be written by people who are experts in the subject, or at least pretty knowledgeable about the subject, for people who know less to learn from. So for me to have written something like that would have been a little bit like the blind leading the blind.
Yeah. And you know what, actually, this isn't exactly the same, but I tutored someone for the first time last CTA sitting on human capital, because that's the area that I work in. And I've had a few other inquiries and stuff in there about tutoring in like other areas and stuff as well, but I just don't want to touch it because I just don't feel like I'll be giving the student justice in those areas that I don't know well. Like I can tutor the generic stuff about how to sit an exam, how you should study for it, etc.
Yes.
But if they had like a direct technical query on something to do with corporation tax, like I'd have to go look it up, and it would take me a lot of time, a lot of effort, and it won't be as good as someone who deals with it like practically day to day. So I just don't want to do it.
No, exactly. And it's an interesting point, isn't it? Because I find I actually very much admire those people who are able to be that generalist. So, for example, my co-writer of the Bloomsbury Corporation Tax Annual, my co-author was very, very good and seemed to know enough about everything to do most of that work. In fact, funnily enough, I almost think some of the best people at this sort of thing are the people who you meet lecturing. So I lecture very specific technical subjects, but there are people who constantly go around doing updates and generalist lectures. Yeah. And I am constantly amazed about how much they know about how many things. I mean, the likes of Pat Noun at Mercier or Rebecca Bennyworth, who everybody, of course, knows, and numbers of others, just their ability to learn a new subject to the extent of sounding like they have known about it for years, even if it was only invented last week, I think is absolutely amazing. And of course, I'm not just saying they just make stuff up. They actually do know their stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it is a slightly odd thing, because I know that there are people who are very, shall we say, excited by the fact that I am a very deep, albeit very narrow specialist, if you like. And it might surprise some people to know that I actually really admire the people who are very broad.
Yeah. And on the flip side, they probably admire you for the also the identical reasons that, on the flip side.
Yes, exactly that.
So I didn't actually know this until we started speaking today, but it sounds like then actually when you decided to merge with Jerem's, that part of your remit was to like help nurture and train the people in the corporation tax team.
Yes, and it's a really interesting point because I mean, the remit was, an awful lot of stuff because you've been involved in the world of tax for, at that point, sort of, just over 33 years, so just over 34 years, and you are an absolute expert or considered to be an absolute expert in a range of related topics. We would love you to teach that and give as much of your 30 plus years of experience as you can to our team. What I have discovered is that far from it being about teaching people about tax, a lot of it is much wider. Some people call them soft skills, but it's a range of things. It's things like how to talk to a client, whether it's by email or over the phone, because I'm not criticizing anybody specifically, but there were people who, when I arrived, when you heard them on the phone or read their draft emails to clients, you just thought, you come across as a very professional and very dull tax advisor. And being professional is, generally speaking, a good thing. I think in our world, things might have been different 60 or 70 years ago, but in our world, being dull is not a good thing. And the old adage about, you'd rather do business with a friend can be expanded out to you'd rather do business with somebody who you quite like chatting to, whether it's by email or phone or when you actually meet them. So there's an awful lot of stuff around client handling, around making the work we do accessible to clients. It's easy to write a report that tells them everything they need to know in a language that they will never understand, or at least would struggle to decode, shall we say. It is much harder to write about complex technical topics in relatively simple English that clients can understand, even if they turn around and say, well, this just makes no sense at all. Because at least then we can say, yes, but you now understand what the tax code says. And yes, if you say it makes no sense at all, you also understand the frustrations we've lived with for the last 20 or whatever it is years. But it's that kind of thing. And various extensions to that. Like, it's easy to say, here's the piece of work you commissioned, thank you very much. It's perhaps slightly harder to say, here's the piece of work you commissioned, and here are ways in which we think we could help you out on this, going forward. Mm-hmm. And all of these are part, I think, of being a successful advisor, because it's, I mean, imagine there's a person who knows absolutely everything about a topic, but they don't speak English and you don't speak their language. Then it's virtually impossible for them to tell you what it is you want to know unless you have an interpreter.
Yeah. So I don't know if this comes across well verbally, but I have like this diagram that I use now when I'm trying to explain to people like how to tailor your language. Like one circle is like your brain, what you've got in your mind. The other circle is the person you're speaking to, their brain, their mind, what they understand. And then you push them together and you've got like the little overlap in the middle. And that's like where you need to talk so you both are understanding each other.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've got a Venn diagram of what, with the overlapping bit being your area of mutual communication.
Exactly, yes.
And to some extent, our job is to make that bit bigger.
Yes.
And I think from our perspective, it is a skill. I mean, I think in this context, I was quite fortunate that I've never found it particularly difficult to explain complicated things in relatively simple terms. And when I've been on courses to learn how to do that, which has happened a couple of times, the people involved have said, honestly, you really shouldn't be here, which is nice. But to some extent, the value of at least one of the courses was that if you are good at something or competent at something instinctively without any training, it makes it very hard to know what it is you do to pass on to other people. And so it is true to say that at least one of the courses I went on, it was only, we're talking about a day of technical writing courses kind of thing, or non-technical writing courses. But one of them was very good at highlighting the things that I was doing instinctively, so that I now know what it is to tell people to do.
Mm-hmm.
Or shall we say, suggest that they ought to do. And I suppose I should also nod to 2 or 3 mentors in this area over the years, both within the Inland Revenue and particularly at KPMG, people who helped me draft stuff in a way that clients could understand. Probably the biggest eye-opener was when I had a policy job at the Inland Revenue and discovered that you kind of have to write like this for ministers, because I'm not going to suggest that ministers are not very clever, but you don't reach the upper echelons of Parliament necessarily by being technically competent at anything. You reach those echelons by playing the policy game, or politics game, rather well. And it's not to say they're stupid, but if you've got no background in tax and somebody makes you the minister responsible for the Inland Revenue, you've got a very big learning curve, and you have to hope that your civil servants can communicate with you in a language you can understand, because you sure as hell ain't got time to learn what they've spent 30 or 20 or whatever it is years learning.
Yeah, absolutely. I like your point actually about, like, if you do something instinctually and naturally, it's very hard to explain to others like how you do it. So I've created like 2 in-depth detailed courses now, one on tax research, one on tax advice. Both areas that I've always kind of been quite good at.
Yeah.
But it was so difficult to be able to then go, well, this is what I do. Why do I do it? How do I do it? How do I tell someone else what I'm doing, so that they can kind of see the steps and be like, now I can follow that and do it myself, right? Because when you do it naturally, you don't really think why you're doing it, you just do it.
Yes. Right? I think that's right. And I remember once with one of the big 4 firms having this conversation with one of the more senior partners in my region who was saying, Pete, if you do want to become a partner in a firm one day, whether it's that firm or another firm, one of the things you will be looked at is as some kind of mentor to the more junior members of the team. So you can't just say, yeah, this is something I do well and I'm just lucky, I guess. You do have to analyze it a little bit yourself. It's not quite like dissecting the goose that lays the golden egg so that it no longer can lay that egg or those eggs, but it is important to try and get some self-understanding, if you like, because otherwise, what exactly are you going to say to people who say, well, you have a really good way with clients, for example, how do we emulate that?
Yeah. And then the thing is as well, if you can't even like help people to get better at those things, and you can't delegate as well, right? So then everything just ends up getting stuck with you anyway, which you don't want.
Yes, I agree.
Just a reminder to benchmark your salary, find out what you're worth, or to discuss available tax roles, get in contact with James at the Tax Recruitment Company. His contact details can be found in the show notes for this episode at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP84. Or you can book a call with him by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/salary chat. And if you're keen to help your staff develop, or you're keen on getting better yourself, why not take a look at my masterclasses for tax professionals to see if you think they will help you. You can see details for current ones at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/masterclasses. So it sounds like anyway you went in thinking you'd be helping more around like technical knowledge and stuff, which is interesting to know that your observation is that is not really where people need help. It's on the soft skills or whatever you want to call them. How is it then that you've actually got involved with like doing the nurturing then on those things? It sounds like you've had to do some like self-reflection yourself to figure out like how you do things and you can share it. But like, how have you done all of this?
Yes, definitely. I mean, just to return to your point about the tax technical side of things, I think the point is they've all either done ATT and CTA exams, or they are going through the process now. So they're all good at studying things like technical tax and familiar with the databases, the places we go to get commentary or explanation or guidance or whatever. And so in a sense, learning the tax stuff is also what they expect. So somebody who comes along and says, well, your grammar's shot to hell, do something about it. I don't want you sounding like an ignorant twit when you write to a client, for example. I don't use that phrase to my team, and nor would I ever. And none of them are twits. But the point I'm making is if you send something with bad grammar, there are a lot of people who won't care, and a few people, and quite often influential people, who will say almost, I don't want to do business with somebody who can't write English properly.
Yeah.
So, yes, it did come as a bit of a surprise, and it took a little while. I mean, not months and months, but it took a couple of weeks, if you like, as things started settling into a groove after the excitement of just joining, before I kind of found my feet in terms of the best way to do these things, or indeed to understand what it is I really needed to do, and then the best way to do them. And I think I've got a number of little sort of lessons in my mind, at least, as to how you need to approach it, or how I approach it, because other people might approach it in a different way. I think the first thing is, and you've almost alluded to this already, that I might as well do it myself sometimes. That kind of works on a one-off, but obviously it doesn't work in the long term, because if you put some effort into something the first 2 or 3 times, hopefully the individuals concerned will then learn to do it well, or well enough, that you don't have to have quite so much input in the future. So it is an investment in the future. To some extent, to a very large extent, I would say, lesson number 1 is you therefore cannot make every piece of work, whether it's written or verbal or whatever, in your own image. I am not God, as it were, and it's only God who makes things or people in his own image. And what that means is, one of the phrases I use a lot with my team is effectively, you've got to find your own voice or your own style. So the broad lesson is, you've got to find ways of communicating with clients in ways that mean the client understands what you're telling them, the client wants to come back to you for further advice or for the next piece of advice, and the client is aware of how much further value we could add in each project in case they do need some more help. Those are the fundamentals, but how you do that has got to be up to you. And I guess in the same way, we all learned, usually at quite a young age, how to make friends. And we all do it differently. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, it does, absolutely. I mean, one of the things I definitely struggled with when I first started reviewing people's work and stuff is a lot of my changes were bringing it into my style.
Yes.
And it's, 1, it was a waste of time. 2, it was being very frustrating for the people on the receiving end of it, because they're never going to write in the way that I write. No. And 3, it's not then giving them the opportunity to grow into their type of advice, the type of advisor that they're going to become, right?
Yes. I think that's absolutely right. And I mean, I realized it in a way because I said, listen to me sometimes when I'm on the phone, or perhaps particularly when it comes to email communications, people get copied in. So I'd say, just read what I've written to them. And then somebody drafted up an email to a client a few days later, and it sort of looked like Pete had written it. And actually, had written it 2 weeks ago, and they just changed the name of the client or something. And I said, look, that's not your style. I mean, I haven't been here long, but I know you well enough to know that's not how you would talk to somebody, whether, verbally or by email, as it were. Do it your way. But the message, if you like, is, this is what you must do. You must communicate and you must make them like you, but you can't do it my way. You've got to do it your way, because everyone has a different voice. I think within the, if you like, getting a little bit deeper into the nitty-gritty, one of the big things I think about client relationships, and particularly because I ran my business alone for 11 years, and I had clients ranging from sort of far end of Cornwall up through into the Hebrides. So, the length and breadth, as it were, of the country. And it meant that there was a very high proportion. I'm probably getting on for 90% of the firms that I assisted. And bear in mind, my client base has very largely over the last 12 or so years been other accountancy or tax advisory firms who need that little extra piece of advice in complex areas. I've not met most of those people. If I've met 10% of them, that would be, to my mind, at a guess, a bit of an overestimate. So you've got to find a way of making those people love you from a distance. I mean, in some ways, because they can't see you and how ugly you are, it makes life much easier. But it means you develop a friendly and open style, whether it's over the phone or by email. One of the things I find I'm good at, and I think it is something that a skill that people really need to think about and try and learn, because without necessarily having to do it my way, I think this is very effective, is remembering things about that person. Okay, now that is something I have a good memory. And that means that if somebody gets on the phone, somebody left me a message on, what day are we today? We're on Wednesday, aren't we? So on Monday, somebody left me a message. And as soon as he said, it's Martin, I thought, I remember you. We did a transaction together about 5 years ago. He also took me to a very nice lunch at a rather lovely place in London. Which in itself is memorable. So, maybe that's why I remembered that person and that thing. But it was interesting that his voice message says, I don't know if you remember me, but we did the so-and-so transaction 5 years ago, and I took you to lunch at this place. And I thought, yes, Martin, I know that. Of course I remember that. And I said to him when I spoke to him, of course I remember you, in that way that you do, even if you didn't, but I did. So where's this going? Well, the point I'm making is that's a perhaps slightly extreme example, particularly because it was a very nice lunch. But, the sort of, last time we spoke, you mentioned that you just had an operation on your knee. Has it recovered yet? Or that your son or daughter had just got engaged or something like that. The sorts of things that people might let slip in a conversation. Now, I suppose that in itself is another element, isn't it? When you have a conversation with somebody, again, particularly verbally, but even over email, open up a little bit about yourself and they'll open up a little bit about themselves. But then coming back to the point I was making about remembering something about the client, if, like me, you have the sort of memory that says, oh, yeah, I remember last time we spoke, your son had just got engaged, I'll say, not quite how's the engagement going? That's perhaps the wrong approach. But, I remember you said your son had just got engaged. How are the wedding plans coming along, or something like that?
Yeah.
So the remembering something about clients is important. And I guess, though, the more preliminary point, which I just tripped over in a way, was how do you find out about some of this stuff in the first place? Because not everybody is as open, perhaps, as I am, as I naturally am. And so maybe one of the things that I found, it's hard to analyze because you can't go and ask the people if this is what they were doing or feeling. But maybe one of the points is that because I am relatively open, people open up to me in a way they perhaps wouldn't to somebody who isn't as open and chatty as me. But it does mean, maybe this is, and you hear about sort of where people go on communications courses and say, well, always ask open questions or something. I think the biggest open question in the world is, how are you?
Which you always get the same response, I'm fine.
Well, yeah, but you see, I don't. I mean, I might do if I'm just passing somebody in the corridor, but if I phone up one of my clients, one of my business contacts, they don't necessarily have to be a client, and they say, how are you? I mean, if I feel like crap because I got the world's worst hangover or just been diagnosed with rabies or something, then I'm probably not going to tell them. But, if you say, yeah, fine, as opposed to, well, do you know what? I'm just enjoying being in the open plan office today. I don't get here very often. I'm only here a couple of days a week, sometimes not even that. I really like being here. That's a completely different answer, isn't it? And the number of times I've had conversations about whether people do or don't like open plan offices, or whether they quite like them but would like to have a room they can lock themselves away in occasionally, or whatever. And, there's just all sorts of ways of being a bit more open. My out-of-office reply, especially when I've gone on holiday, will probably tell you where I've gone on holiday and what I'm doing. And very often I've gone to one or other of my favorite haunts to do some scuba diving. Okay, I cannot tell you how many conversations I've had with people where they've, when we've next spoken, or they've dropped me an email or something and said, oh, I hope you're enjoying it, or I did it once, or I've never done it, but I tried some snorkeling in this place, and blah, 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 blah. And you have conversations about your holiday hobbies, which you wouldn't have if you just said, I am away until the 24th of July.
Yeah. You know what though, actually, you say about having your own voice in like your writing and
Mm.
stuff. I think probably a bit wider is you need to find your own style, generally speaking. So, you said you might
Yes.
remember if someone told you that son's been engaged or they've had an operation or something like that. I
Mm.
tend to not remember that type of stuff because if I'm being honest, it might sound harsh, but I'm actually not interested in that stuff. But if I found like a common thing that we're both interested in,
Mm.
let's say, I don't know, board games or skiing or something like that,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
would remember that. And for me, it's very much
Mm.
about being professional, but being you still at
Yes.
work. Because I think then you'll end up attracting people that are similar to you, and you'll probably
Yes.
enjoy working with them as well. That's just my view on it, anyway.
Well, I think that may be true. When it comes to clients, though, I think it's almost worth making the effort to appear interested, even if you're not. And I mean, I know of, I can't even remember which firm it was, but I once worked for a firm that had that sort of standard client contact database that you were meant to complete after every contact with anyone ever, and nobody ever did. But there was actually a sort of comments section. And this was the bit where you were meant to say, spoke to him on the 25th of July, and he mentioned his son's having an operation next week or something,
Yeah.
But the point behind it was to remind either that person or anyone else who, in theory, is supposed to go into the database before contacting that client, about something that might be useful to know. But let's look at it a slightly different way. If it is not your natural style to be chatty and open with your clients when you're on the phone or emailing them or whatever, it's worth trying to nurture such a style, interested or not, because people, I think, at least as far as my experience is concerned, people rather like it. But at the same time, if they tell you something, write it down.
Yeah.
Write it down somewhere. I mean, I'm the sort of person who, if somebody phones me up and wants to talk about a piece of technical work that they might want my help on, that I will try and write down some notes as we are talking, including reminding myself what I might have said to them about fee quotes, which I don't always remember to do all of the above, but I do my best. But, if I've written on the same page, and I don't, as I say, generally need to, but if I were someone else with a less receptive memory to that sort of thing, I might have written down on the same page this piece of news that might be worth remembering later.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, I suppose, in a way, if we hark back to it may come instinctively to me, but I've got to teach other people how to do it, then I have analysed a little bit that I think because I am an open person, I mean, my late wife used to criticise me sometimes for giving too much away about myself over the phone when I'm chatting to complete strangers. But commercially, I think it has borne fruit because people like an open person, an open personality. But if that is not your natural style, I think in terms of client handling, unless you have some other completely amazing way of making clients love you, I think this is a way in which, you should maybe interrogate yourself and try and change the way you approach, in particular, phone calls with clients in order to appear more open and therefore kind of start building a relationship. Because when you are open with somebody, they feel closer to you. I think this is almost like the axiom here, and therefore they open up a bit to you and then you feel close to them.
Yeah. No,
and especially if they do have something in common. So, there are one or two people I know who are quite big scuba divers. But even if they're not, if you've then, even if you've been faking it at first, after a time, it becomes the natural way in which you approach these conversations. And if you make a point of writing stuff down because you haven't got a great memory for that sort of thing, then, you get to continue the conversation next time you speak to them.
Mm-hmm. So there's a few things on this then, just the overall topic of teaching all these different things. Like the first piece I think is letting someone be aware. So you can tell someone, right, oh, you should be a bit more friendly with them. You should ask them some questions, etc. That's almost like the awareness, right? What they're not doing. But then how do you take it from you've helped them become aware to then helping them get better at it? Like what activities have you been doing to like try and help with that? For example, like particular things you've done to teach people and help them get better at these things.
Well, I think
just making them aware.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is leading by example. And certainly when it comes to written communication, so obviously mainly emails or written reports, the deal is You look at what I've done and see how it compares with what you do or did. And it doesn't, I always do make the point that just because I've put something or done something to your piece of work doesn't mean my version is better than yours. I might think so. Otherwise, why would I be telling you or suggesting that you do it this way? But, I think the important thing is to remember these guys are not, idiots that need to be kind of programmed. They are human beings that need to be guided. So I'm always happy to debate that sometimes, yes, okay, I agree, maybe your way was a better way of putting it. But coming back to the question you asked, so if I write an email to someone and my colleague or one of my colleagues is copied in, I hope they are reading that and seeing that I didn't just say, dear Mr. Smith, here is the tax report you commissioned, fare thee well, Pete. But it'll be, dear John, here's the tax report you asked for. Make a couple of comments about it, especially if there's anything in there that might have been perhaps suggesting we could do a little bit more work beyond the scope, or if I've not done part of what the original scope said for some good reason or whatever, but also trying also to put something friendly in. So, again, if I happen to have heard a piece of news from him last time we spoke to see how that played out, or if there's nothing like that, at least still make it sound good and friendly. And I always end up with, I hope everything makes sense, but please don't hesitate to pick up the phone or drop me an email if you want to kind of chat anything through. So you're kind of opening that door as well at the end of every email. Now, that is kind of the sort of phrase I use, but I want other people to use different phrases, not just to mirror my phraseology. But to some extent, therefore, it's leading by example. But every time I do that, I do make a big point of saying, do not just copy and paste my email. Develop your own voice. So when I see one or other of my lads, doing something, sending an email to a client that has a chatty bit and is clearly in their voice, I hope you enjoyed your skiing trip to, Hawaii or whatever it was. I'm all kind of excited that they've learned this thing, but they're doing it in their way. Mm-hmm. I think with longer pieces of written work like reports, there's a couple of points around this. First of all, however much it's a formal technical report, there's still scope to say it in your way, not my way. We all speak English slightly differently. We all write English slightly differently. And I mean, you like me have probably read quite a few tax textbooks, or rather more articles on tax issues. And, you could pick up a typical copy of Taxation or the Tax Journal for the sake of argument and read 2 or 3 very informative articles that you find extremely interesting, all of which were written in entirely different styles. Yeah. So even though it's technical writing, there is scope for your style to be in there. And I try and encourage people to use their style. On the other hand, I've learned a lot of lessons as to how to make things easy to understand. Probably the biggest and most important thing is that lots of short sentences are much, much better than one long sentence. It doesn't matter how many commas, colons, semicolons, or hyphens you put into the sentence. If it's long, you will actually be out of breath by the time you get to the end.
Yeah.
And sentences with lots of hanging sort of clauses and things, often you find by the time you've got to the end, you've forgotten what the bits at the beginning were all about. And, when we did early days of computer programming, when you had kind of nested commands in brackets and things, and you had to make sure you got the right numbers of brackets, a bit like doing functions in Excel. Well, English language works like that. In a long sentence with lots of subjects, objects, adjectival clauses, and so on, you've got to make sure that everything links up with everything else. And that for every, concept you open, for every subject, there's an object or conclusion somewhere in the sentence. Yeah. That's much easier to do if all your sentences are short.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Because it's a technical piece of work, there's no harm in listing stuff. It might be tempting to say in a conversation, to qualify for this tax relief, you must have held 10% of the shares for at least a year and be entitled to 10% of the dividends and 10% of the votes or something. Okay. But if you're writing that down, don't you think it's much clearer if you say there are 4 conditions, all of which must be satisfied? Bang, 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 bang.
Yeah. I was definitely guilty of this, by the way, when I first started working in tax.
Yes. And I think that's one of those areas where I actually learned partly by myself and partly through being taught that, I went to the sort of school which kind of encouraged you to read books where people wrote in a very erudite way, not just textbooks, but, so-called literature. And sometimes you think, you know what, you could have said that in a lot fewer words, or you could have said that just as well in 3 times as many sentences, each with 1/3 of the words in it. But I kind of was taught to write in that somewhat lofty style. And when I came out into the civil service, I realized fairly quickly, and with a bit of prompting from a couple of very, very helpful colleagues, that actually short, sharp sentences are much punchier and much easier to follow.
Yeah.
So, that's just one example, but I think that and being unafraid to list things, if those are, in effect, if they are a list of things, then why hide from the fact that that's what they are? So that in terms particularly of written communication, I think is hugely important. You've got to be clear, and it's much easier to be clear if you use a series of short sentences.
Yeah, and you can still do that in your own voice, right? When we're thinking about like people who have like their own voices, 2 tax writers come to mind who I think, if you read any of their articles, it's undoubtedly them. Keith Gordon.
Yep, absolutely.
Look at any of his articles. He's got such a consistent trend with how he writes. It's undeniably him every time. And Neil Warren, 2 writers who have absolutely nailed their own voice, by the way. So for anyone that's interested in that, take a look at a few of their articles. You'll see what I mean.
Yeah. I read Neil's articles, even though he writes almost exclusively about VAT.
Exactly, same. And I don't do anything in VAT really, but I still like reading his articles because he's got such a nice way of writing it, and it's always, you can just tell it's him that's written it. It's not someone that's written it for him.
Exactly.
He's written it. Yeah. But I think though, anyway, even though people have their own voice, there's always these like what I'm starting to call hallmarks of like what makes something good, right? So you've said about with report writing, short sentences, usually bullet points, all good things. That having those short sentences are good. You can write short sentences in your own voice, so that's fine.
Yeah.
And there's loads of other things as well. So I'm guessing now when you're like reviewing people's work and stuff, you're not looking to change their voice. You're just making sure the hallmarks of what is good exist. So if you're saying like you need to be friendly in your email, you're making sure that that's there, even if it's in their own voice, maybe not put in the same place where you put it, but it's there somewhere.
Exactly. And with longer written work, we all went to school, and maybe people were taught English differently from the way I was taught, but I was taught, for example, that every piece of written work has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And actually, within a piece of written work, every section or chapter or whatever has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And sometimes every paragraph or every sentence can have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And if you remember those simple rules, what you're essentially saying is, here is a report that's going to tell you about this. Then you tell them about it. Then at the end, you conclude by telling them what you've told them.
Yeah.
And that can happen throughout the report too. So you say, well, so the conditions for this bit of the relief to apply are, and you say, that there are conditions. Here are the conditions. Those were the conditions. And I'm not trying to just list all the things that make good writing, but in essence, you can relate that to what everybody's done, because everybody's read books or at least short stories in the past. And all of those things, books and novels, most books indeed, and certainly short stories, have a very clear beginning, middle, and end. And I'm like, you are telling a story to a client. In this report, it may not be the most interesting story. It's not Hans Christian Andersen or the Brothers Grimm, but it is a story. And you need to make sure that they understand what you're telling them and why you're telling them it. Then you tell them it, and then you explain the what you have come to, your conclusions or recommendations, if you will, having told them the story, and make sure that that end bit relates to the beginning, which sort of starts off with what they wanted to know and why.
Yeah.
And that's almost a life lesson, because technically it's the same in written communication, isn't it? you open your mouth to tell somebody something, so you might as well make sure they understand what you're going to tell them and what you have told them.
Yeah. Just before we move off this section then anyway, I just want to highlight one point that you mentioned kind of about, I want to call it, you didn't use this words, but for me, it's like comparing what they've written compared to what it looks like as a final product after you've reviewed it, after you made changes, etc.
Yes.
Because I think you can get so much value from that as like a junior member of staff. As you said, like you acknowledging that what you've done isn't necessarily better. But this is where I think it's important for them to understand why you've done something, because then going forward, they can make that decision for themselves to think, well, Pete does this, this is why. I don't necessarily agree with that, so I'm not going to copy Pete. I'm going to do it this way because I think that's better, and that's more reasonable in this case. So for anyone listening, I suppose, that's working with managers who's reviewing work for them, do that comparison and understand why the changes have been made, because you'll get so much from that.
I think that's right. And it's a difficult one in a way on a number of levels. I mean, the first thing is, if you send me a piece of work, and the longer the piece of work, the harder this becomes. If you send me a piece of work and I send it back with lots of track changes, however you then choose to review what I have done, it is obviously awfully tempting to just accept all the tracked changes, skim through for any obvious typos, and say, Pete's improved it, I'll send it to the client. And of course, there are some people in our world or in the world at large who frankly want that, who aren't that bothered about teaching anybody anything. But also, if you do that, you learn a lot less. And it's all very easy, even for me, to say to somebody, look, just get it out to the client because we need to get it out, but make a point of reading it yourself and seeing what I have done differently, so that you can come to me and say, either I agree with what you've done, or I'm not sure why you've done this, Pete, please explain, or even I don't agree with you. And if I'd had the time to review it again myself, I would have questioned you on it at that point, okay? So in a way, what I try and do, at least after the first round, is to say, here are my high-level thoughts about what you can do to improve this piece of work. Now go away and do that, rather than sending them back something with lots of track changes.
Yeah.
But you can only do that probably once per piece of work in terms of, you know, you can't keep saying, no, I wanted you to approach it this way, or no, why do you think the client would not understand it the way you've put it together? So almost the second iteration, I do have to do the track changes. Now, obviously, I'm making it sound like none of my people can write very well, which is totally unfair and is not true, is not a reflection of reality. But nevertheless, because of the way track changes work anyway, they always look very messy and make it look, even on something relatively simple, as though you have devastatingly eviscerated their prose. But I feel, at least on that first reiteration, if I explain why I feel this or how I feel this piece of work could be improved, then they will learn more by trying to follow my instruction, is that the word? Follow my suggested approach, but write it or rewrite it themselves.
Yeah.
I had an interesting pushback from one of my team literally a couple of hours ago, because he said, but we've only got a relatively small fee on this because we said we're only doing a high-level review. And, you know, what you're saying sounds like a lot more detail. And I guess in that context, there were two elements. One is, well, it's not a big fee because it's a high-level review, but then you're cheap. And it's a relevant point, because his charge out rate is about 20% of mine. So whereas it's set at about 2 hours of my time, it becomes 10 hours of his. So we've got that leeway commercially, which is an important consideration, but is also highlighting the fact that he's still learning. Oh, we never stop learning, any of us, but he's got more to learn, at least in this context, perhaps, than I have. But secondly, the point I was making is that just because you want to do a high-level, relatively sparse note to the client to highlight, for example, the risk areas in a particular context, it doesn't mean that you mustn't have in the back of your mind all the detailed complexities. In fact, you must have those in your mind, because you've got to be able to allude to them in your notes, saying, you know, obviously, but we need to make sure for example, in this case, that there are no shares that were issued other than for new consideration, for example. In other words, there are no bonus shares in the structure because that would give us a problem. So you may not necessarily want to go all the way through the detail of why that could be a problem for a fee of only 2 hours of my time. But what we need to be able to do is to say, please let us know if there is any such thing, because, this could be a problem. And then they might say, oh, well, we have got something. Could you please put something in about why this is a problem, or numerically why the problem doesn't exist? So it was an interest. I suppose that wasn't really the main lesson. The main lesson was the bit about the pushback. Yes, but Pete, you said it's high level, and yet this is turning into, your instructions are quite lengthy. Instructions, forgive me, suggestions are quite lengthy. and as I say, the point I'm making is that he, I hope, is going to learn more from thinking about what I've just told him, or, in terms of the mindset with which I think we should approach the piece of work. I think he's going to learn more from that, and then doing that sort of second version himself, than if I rewrote a huge chunk of it and just sent it back to him and said, have a look at this when you get a moment.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think us as whatever we call it, nurturers, managers, mentors, whatever we end up calling ourselves, I do think we have a responsibility to do both the things you've talked about. One, which is send it back to them with some high level comments so that they can think it through themselves, because you get a lot from that. And then two, is give people the opportunity to ask you those questions when you have changed what they've done.
Yes. And in many ways, it is gratifying that my team seem perfectly comfortable coming and challenging me with these things. And I'm perfectly comfortable occasionally saying, okay, let's do it your way. Or indeed, you are right. That does sound better, because none of us is perfect and none of us is ever the finished article. And unfortunately, we've all grown up with peers or senior colleagues who think they are both of those things. And I try not to be that person, because you're not going to learn anything from somebody who you're scared to ask or challenge.
Of course, absolutely. And if you are that person that always makes that you're right, your staff aren't going to ask you questions anymore, and they're going to it's going to restrict their learning big time.
Well, exactly that. Learning is about questioning and challenging and discovery.
Yeah.
It's not about picking up a book and being told.
No, the real, I suppose, benefit comes from the experience of doing it.
Yeah, exactly that.
So on the flip side then, anyway, because obviously we've got our responsibilities to help them learn, by doing what we talked about, giving them the opportunity to improve things, letting them ask questions of us and all those things. But on the flip side, what is the individual's responsibility, the person who's been mentored or helped, when it comes to being nurtured, so that you can maximize the benefit from it? And I suppose have us want to help them.
I think a willingness to listen and learn is huge. Given what we've just said, I think a willingness to challenge as well, or at least ask. Questions are not always challenges. Questions can be, I don't understand, or they can be a way of saying, I challenge your view, and throwing down a gauntlet, as it were, not necessarily that aggressively. And I think, to some extent, a willingness to learn and an openness to learning also means being prepared to put a certain amount of effort in. So if we go back to the example I gave where I said, I did a fairly hefty rewrite of a piece of work, and then said, we promised it to the client by tomorrow morning. So, it's already late. Just make sure there are no obvious glaring typos and we'll send it off straight away. I need to know that you, the person who wrote the first version, will nevertheless take it away, have a little read through, and I'm not saying you need to take notes or come and report to me or anything like that, but just try and take away a couple, maybe 3 lessons of any sort, general or specific, from your review of the thing that I effectively had to redo myself. In an ideal world, we'll always have the time for me to say, here's the high-level comments, you go and do the second version, and I think they're always going to learn more from that. And so far that's always been the case. What's come back in those circumstances has always been vastly better than the first, in my humble opinion. And then, yes, I might well still send it back with some tracked changes because they're all still learning. But, I don't want to go back with high-level comments again, because that starts being very boring as well. You want to say, you've made the effort, I've now put some thoughts in, let's get this thing out there.
Yeah, I think, to be fair, that's pretty much the exact same things that I think they should do as well. I mean, the biggest frustration for me when I'm trying to help someone get better is when I feel like they're just not put 100% in, or dare I say, in some cases, have been lazy with the work they produced.
And I think, yes, and I do see that occasionally. Actually, I tell you what I see. I don't think it's lazy. I think, and I've got a couple of specific instances in mind. I think it is very easy to forget that in amongst all of this, we're also, as a team, trying to produce work for clients. And that sometimes everybody's under the cosh trying to get the stuff out the door. And not everything that's being done in my business unit is being done for me or for our business unit. There's a certain amount of general advisory work for the bigger firm, the wider firm and all of that stuff. So it can be a bit frustrating. And there have been a couple of occasions when I said, well, why didn't you do whatever it was that I suggested you at least review? And the answer was because it had to get out the door and I ran out of time. When you look at the timesheet and find they spent half a day that week dealing with corporation tax computations from the audit department because those had to be done because there was a statutory deadline. So I think it's important to distinguish between laziness and just getting the damn thing out the door because you've got to get it out and done and paid for, of course.
Yeah.
I think the other big lesson, though, and this is one where I think careful time management is important, because I get an awful lot of, well, I'm sorry it had a couple of typos in, but we'd promised it to the client by the end of this afternoon. And my point is, if you had started drafting a day or so earlier, you would have finished yesterday. And therefore, when you picked it up this morning, you would be doing a final review of the finished article, as opposed to finishing it today so close to the deadline to get it out the door that some of the little typos go unnoticed. I mean, fortunately, nothing major, but, misspelling somebody's name, for example, is always a horrible embarrassment. But the wider lesson here is I say to people, okay, I've picked this up, and in the first 5 paragraphs, I've found 2 sentences that don't end. We've all done that. I mean, I listen to myself talking sometimes, not too often because it's very dull, but I listen to myself talking, or sometimes I watch or read the transcripts of somebody else's interview, and you realize that we often don't talk in full sentences. I mean, I did there, perhaps because I was being very conscious of it, but sometimes you start a thought and then you say, but looking at it a different way, and you haven't actually looked at it the first way yet. Now, you can do that in a conversation, but to have unfinished sentences, or in one case, memorably an unstarted sentence, which was hysterical, you just say, look, if you had because I know it's impossible when you finish writing something to go back to the beginning and read it through in a critical way, because your eyes are seeing what you think you typed, even if it was an hour ago or just before lunch or something. But if you've put it away for 24 hours and you pick it up, so you finish yesterday lunchtime and it's got to go out to the client this afternoon or first thing in the morning. So today, first thing after lunch, you pick up that document and give it that final proofread. You will pick up an awful lot of stuff that I've had to pick up reading it afresh. And I really shouldn't be having to correct the fact that your sentence doesn't end or doesn't start, or, you've got a hanging participle somewhere, or you've missed an entire chunk of the thing out because when you cut and pasted something, you accidentally forgot to hit the paste function when you were moving it around the document or something like that. And we've all seen all of those things happen. But it's much harder to do them or to let them go out unnoticed if you've actually stopped and proofread the thing a decent period. And I always say at least 24 hours after you finish drafting.
Yeah. It's hard to spot your own mistakes, isn't it?
It is. And that is why you have a 4 eyes system, that somebody senior in the team should sign it out anyway. But my point is you should still correct your own English.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And finish your own sentences and put your own full stops in before I get round to. If I'm correcting your grammar and syntax and punctuation, then you failed.
Yeah, no,
To some extent.
Yeah, I feel the same, to be fair. But I'm interested in your view on this. It's probably a bit of a touchy subject maybe for some people, and it can seem harsh, right? But do you ever think there's a point where a colleague or a staff member is like a lost cause in a way, like you've tried to help them a lot, you've given them feedback, but things just don't seem to be getting any better?
And certainly not in my current team. I have no hesitation in saying that. I have seen it, and I'm fortunate so far that I've never been the person who had to take any action in that respect. But your issues are twofold, aren't they? Is this person useful enough to stick around at the current level? And if they are they willing to do that, given that they may well have been recruited or just generally come to expect that after a certain amount of time and a certain level of experience, they would get promoted to the next level? Or two, is this somebody who is such a lost cause, I just need to manage them out of the business or business unit?
Yeah.
And in a way, I mean, very often, you can sort of manage these things by not managing them, if that makes sense. Because what I've seen is people saying, well, he's expecting a pay rise because it's been 12 months or something. And if I don't give him one, then he'll either come and ask, in which case I shall have to tell him, or he'll go looking for another job, in which case he becomes someone else's problem. Now, I'm not sure that's the right answer, because surely you should explain what's going on to the person concerned, otherwise it's not fair. But on the other hand, you're suggesting the lost cause scenario rather implies that you've had this conversation many times before.
Yeah.
And basically come to the conclusion they really are a lost cause, and it doesn't matter what you say, they'll just continue thinking they ought to have been given that promotion, so you might as well just let them go to somewhere else. There's a standard form of reference, was this person usually conscious during the working day kind of stuff, which you can fill in without having to sort of cross your fingers behind your back and hope nobody asks the question. So, yes, I've seen it, but yes, it can be. I think in a sense, if you're happy to manage someone out, that's actually relatively easily doable. I mean, you should do it humanely, as it were, but it's reasonably easy to sort of encourage somebody to look at adverts for jobs in other firms. The harder conversation might be to have is are you suited for this career?
Yeah.
I haven't had to do that. But I think in a way, it's probably the hardest conversation is for the person you genuinely do want to keep, because they do a bloody good job at the grade that they're at. But how do you say to somebody with ambition, look, we love you and you're going to make a great senior manager, but nobody I know thinks you ought to be promoted above senior manager. And there are two difficulties. One, of course, is that it's a huge blow to their ego, because it's very personal. For all that we talk about it being just work, success is personal success. And so it is personal. But the second thing, of course, is there are always firms out there who will match their aspirations. I say I don't want this person going above senior manager, and the firm up the road goes, well, they've got this really experienced corporate tax person and they won't make him a director, so why don't we ask him if he'd like to be a director in our firm? And that leaves me with a hole in my team and arguably a slightly enhanced competitor.
Yeah.
So how do you persuade that person to stay with you, even though you're not going to match their aspirations? Because sometimes it's not about the money, it's that they want to be called a director or whatever. But it's not fair to the other directors who have specific roles and obligations as directors, not necessarily statutory directors, but who, because they have the title director. It's not fair to them to say to this person, okay, for the sake of keeping you, we'll call you a director, even though we expect you to act just like a senior manager.
Yeah.
So it's a really tough conundrum.
It is. Although, to be fair, I think maybe I'm just over optimistic with this, but I think most people can change those small things. Let's say that people said they were cap senior manager. I think you can probably help them if they wanted to anyway, change to do the stuff that they needed to, so that they could be a director. Then it's almost like down to them in a way, right? Whether they want to do those things or not.
I think that's probably right. I mean, there may be some people for whom it just is a step too far. But I mean, the predicate of the question was, we've done all of the above, and there is nothing more that can be done.
Yeah, fine. Yeah, I understand.
To allow that person to go to the next step.
Yes, no, fair enough. Understood. So I've been trying like a few different things recently, I suppose, to try and help people get better at certain things. So probably the most recent thing I've tried actually is shadowing.
Yeah.
Particularly, I had someone shadow me when I was reviewing a contract because I wanted them to see, I suppose, the level of detail that I went into when I looked at a contract and the amount of stuff I picked up. I found that quite successful. Obviously, we've talked about like reviewing people's works, giving them feedback and that helping. Is there anything else that you've tried that you think has been successful in terms of helping them to learn and develop?
Gosh, there are so many things, and often they're very tiny little things. I mean, for example, start a little bit earlier because the deadline is not when it's got to get to the client, but 24 hours before that, or even 48 hours before that, when you have proofread it yourself and then send it to me for the final, pre-client review. I think we've probably covered all the main things, because once you get to the sort of slightly second, third, and fourth order things, then if you're not careful, you start telling people how to do things, and therefore they start losing their own voice or their own approach. But I think if there was one last lesson I would say to everybody is always stay open to talking widely and chattily to your clients, but also open to new experience, new ways of looking at things, etc., because that way you will always continue to learn. And maybe that's the big thing. Always assume that you are not the finished article and there is always something to learn from someone else. And I think at a high level, those are the things I would put across. Yeah, I can't think of anything else, really. I mean, I can think of lots of minor specific things that I'd love to be able to chat about, but, I think they are just tiny little issues and one-offs and things rather than big, wide lessons for the world at large.
Yeah, I think we've alluded to everything, probably at least briefly anyway. You said about like people listening to you on the phone, looking at your emails, probably joining meetings, shadowing, giving people the chance to just try things. These are all like related to what we've talked about already. I suppose you just haven't mentioned them explicitly.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
If people want to learn more about you anyway, Pete, or get in touch, where are the best places for them to go?
Well, I mean, obviously, there's lots of stuff out there that I've written if you're after stuff on technical tax. If you just want to chat to me, well, I don't know, do my email and contact numbers go out on the podcast or whatever in some way? Or
yeah, they're part of what's called the show notes.
Yep, absolutely fine. Well, certainly if anyone wants to chat anytime, I mean, subject, of course, to the constraints of getting client work out the door, I like to think I'm quite approachable. I'm hoping that things like CIOT branch meetings and conferences that people run are starting to open out a bit. I mean, there still seems to be quite a reluctance to go and do face-to-face stuff, but I'm hoping people will start attending stuff again. And I try and get out and about and meet and talk to people, because I think it's the best way of catching up, keeping up, and putting across your own message. So I am approachable. Come talk to me anytime you want.
For me, that was such an enjoyable conversation with Pete, and he makes many good points, which I completely agree with. Hopefully, you've taken away some useful gems to help you better nurture and help your tax staff to develop. Show notes for this episode can be accessed at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP84. And the show notes include links to all the links mentioned throughout this episode, including links to get more information in relation to the Tax Research Masterclass and the Tax Advice Masterclass. If you enjoyed this episode, you can get email notifications for all future episodes by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/subscribe. Episodes are bi-weekly and are released on Mondays. But that's it for this episode. I hope you've taken away some useful points to help you to progress develop, and improve your tax career. Until next time.